I just want to talk to you briefly, sort of, about this idea of myth. I know that you've watched Darlene's video already because some of these things I've left up because I feel like she does such a good job talking about them. So then I'll give you the chance to look at them and then, also go over them and sort of from a bit of a different place or perspective afterwards. So we're thinking about religion, creation stories, this sort of thing. We often don't think about those things as being myth because typically, we've been raised to believe in our social body that myths are something that are like not true, right? It's the myth of women being like this, or the myth of, and so I think that's not a very accurate way to look at things, but it is how it kind of gets misused, and it's like really commonly taken, to mean that way. That's a cultural myth, that's a social myth, that's just a myth, right? As an untrue sort of thing. I think what's useful when we're thinking about religion and creation stories and these kinds of things is if we think about a myth as like a narrative, sort of as Darlene talked about, right? These stories that explain things, and it's not a matter of truth necessarily or not, but it's a narrative that's operative, that is useful for those who believe it. Then we can go at things a little bit differently, especially when we're investigating the way that sort of religious stories and traditions and histories have kind of impacted how we operate in the world that we're operating in today. And so, I think all the time about the current issues that we're operating, in within our daily lives and the kinds of things that we see on a regular basis. Um, One of the easiest examples, I think, is to think about abortion. And also, it's been a really hot topic lately in politics, and especially in the States, right? We've been hearing about all of these states that are passing these super crazy restrictive, like, bills and attempting to implement bills and policies and laws that really sometimes aren't even realistic, but also that have a direct bearing on the way that people are living their lives, right, every single day. So lots and lots and lots of the foundation, the basis for this kind of legislation is that it's morally wrong, that it's murder according to God, and that might be true. I don't know God, so I couldn't say. But I think if we step back and understand that it's, you know, things that are operative in any given sort of tradition or religion, that there are these myths, they're narratives, they're creation stories, they're meant to help people to make sense of the world that they live in, but that there's not necessarily, doesn't have to be a truth or a non-truth, right? A truth or a lie. Then we can get after some of these social issues in a bit of a different way. Because, for example, one of the sort of slogans that the pro-choicers have always thrown back is keep your rosaries off my ovaries. And I think, what's useful about thinking about these two things, a slogan like that and how it directly addresses religion, and also this sort of conversation around myth, is that your creation story, your religious beliefs might be true for you, and maybe they're not even true for you. Maybe for you it's not even a matter of truth or not, but maybe what we're all sort of dealing with is what helps us to make sense of the world. And if we can stand back and think of these creation stories and these mythic narratives that sort of ground us and ground the evolution of humanity and help us to organize our world in a way that lets us make sense of things and organize our lives, and then I can see that like what might be useful for me might not be useful for you, and vice versa, so that what is someone's anti-choice stance because it offends their religious sensibilities and their religious morality is specific to their worldview and is not necessarily true for me. And we know that in the world that we're operating in, there are many, many, many paths and many ways to see the world and frame the world, and lots of different sort of mythic narratives that you might choose to adhere to or that you might choose to implement in organizing your world and thinking about your own life and all these things. And so I think this idea of investigating what we mean by myth and the kinds of stories that would fall under that category can be very useful in terms of operating in the world, especially when we think about these kinds of issues that are often so divisive, and such hot topics and really, really, sensitive, and where there's a very personal investment a lot of the time in how people argue these things and how people see these things and experience these things. And, you know, when I teach this stuff in 100 around this specific issue, I always say, you know, like I absolutely welcome your choice not to want to have this procedure or to, you know, engage with this kind of medicine, but I'll always fight for your right to make that choice because I'm aware that my framework is not the framework that everybody uses. And so whether we want to say that in terms of, you know, religious affiliation or, you know, mythic narratives or how I organize my world, I think recognizing that there's such the multitude of paths, multitude of sort of methods for engaging the world and framing the world. Myth, you know, understood as being a narrative that is useful and helpful to organize the world around us, but not necessarily being a matter of truth or not, takes some of the sting out of these issues and can allow us to maybe have a more fruitful discussion about how do we legislate, how do we move forward, is there a need for legislation? If I don't, you know, if I'm religiously and morally offended by the idea, for example, like I said, of an abortion, then I don't have to have one because it doesn't jive with my worldview and the narrative that I've used to frame the world that I live in. That might not be true of my neighbor. And so not arguing things necessarily from this place of truth, which we know is subjective anyway, right? Truth is a very hard thing to really get a hold of because it's subjective. So that was sort of my pop by to, you know, think about this idea of myth and what exactly, you know, we're thinking about it in terms of, you know, this our class, right, and the academic investigations that we've been doing and how we are slogging through our material. I also wanted to make the link and the connection to the world that you're living in, right? I feel like that's really important when we're thinking about what we're studying, that we can find a way to transfer it into our immediate sort of lived experience. And I think this discussion about myth is really, really useful. And the way that we explore it in our material is useful, but then that making that transition, being able to apply it, you know, kind of across the board and think about these things, I think it's a really interesting way to engage sort of an area that can be really contentious, political, and upsetting, and touches all kinds of buttons. But also, like I said, then I think on the other hand, it can be really, really useful because it does remove some of this sting if we're able to kind of step back a little and think about the purpose of a myth and what it's for and who adheres to it and how come. Then we've got something really handy to work with. So it's just a quick little blurb for this week to, you know, throw that out there in terms of applying what you're learning. I will see you back here just shortly to talk about the next week's video. Okay, bye-bye.